Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all of you to this new episode of The Future of Europe. Today we have the pleasure of hosting Mariam Moulare, who's a student in Master 1 in International and European Law. Very nice to meet you, Mariam.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Of course. So today the topic we'll be addressing is related to EU competition law and the different forms of state aid that are granted within the football industry. The goal is to provide a glimpse of the tensions between EU rules and the particularities of the football industry and how this influences the future of Europe in this field. Could you tell us a little bit more?
Of course. So we all know the football industry is a blend of politics, law, economics, and this, combination becomes particularly interesting when considering the relationship between European competition law and, football industry, and when national authorities step in to help and give loans, for example, to football clubs. Football has evolved from a local distraction to a global business, with clubs operating on a very large scale, and the financial boundaries that are crossed are enormous. So this raises, legal questions on is the European Union competent enough to come in and, supervise all of these state aids that are being given and ensure that there's still, fair competition within the internal market. I'm sure we all have wondered at some point how and why we always hear about astronomical sums of money in the football industry, and state aid plays a huge part in that.
It's true that this topic is very interesting, and now that you say it, it's true that the economy of the football world is always so baffling when we hear about it, but it's complicated to understand where it all comes from. Isn't it true that recent cases have dealt with these state aid issues?
Indeed, it is a recent case I've been working on, and I've been really interested in dealt with that subject. It was a judgment of the European Court of Justice between the Commission and Valencia Club of Football that's based in Spain. So basically what happened is that the Commission, after a very long investigation and a lot of research, came to the conclusion that the Football Club of Valencia received loans from the Spanish authorities that for them constituted illegal measures of state resources, and so they ordered their recovery. But the General Court in first instance retained that the Commission came to that conclusion by grounding itself on researches that were not fact-based, taken into account the economy at the time that the loans were given to them. And so they chose to annul the decision from the Commission, and the Commission chose to go to second instance and, rely on the highest chamber of the European Court of Justice.
And what was the outcome of this case before the ECJEU?
So like I said before, after a thorough analysis and coming into the second instance of the ECJ, the court held that the Commission had not taken into account, the positive impact of the 2009 recapitalization process, which was a very important information while assessing if the state aid was illegal or legal. So yeah, they were also saying the same thing as the General Court held, and they also decided to annul the Commission's decision.
It's very interesting to see that the Commission is not put on a pedestal, and their decisions can also be reviewed by the EU bodies. But is there already an existing legal framework around EU competition law and state aid when it comes to the football industry?
As a matter of fact, there is the Lisbon Treaty in 2009 laid the groundwork for the European Union for all subjects related to sports. Before that, the EU didn't really intervene in the sports industry and wasn't really equipped with any powers to intervene as well. They did not have any competence. So European competition law and the sports industry really did not go hand in hand. But since the effectiveness of the treaty, it really constitutes an economic activity. So sports falls within the scope of the treaty, and they have to abide by the rules and the provisions that are set out by the EU. That process was the first step in asserting, the effectiveness of the treaty and making sure that, sport bodies also abide by the rules. And it also gave the EU a certain legitimacy to intervene in all these processes. Some of people say that the Lisbon Treaty has to be viewed in a critical way because even though it set, some really good foundations for European law and sports law, it also kind of laid back in the sense that it said, okay, the rules will apply now to the sport industry, but we're also keeping, a supervising position, and we leave a certain autonomy to the sport bodies, like FIFA, for example, that's an autonomous body within the football industry. And in the case I was just talking to you about earlier, we can see that the EU, by the intermediary of the Commission, takes its supervising role really seriously regarding state aid, economic impact, ensuring that there's a fairness in the internal market. It's important to point out that since 2007, the Commission has sometimes adopted a very aggressive, also a stand against state aid loans and stuff like that, that are granted by national authorities to step in and support football clubs. But at the same time, knowing the enormous activity that's the football world and, the financial impact that it can have, I think it's also important that the EU has a more intervenist part in that whole process. So yeah.
That's very interesting to see. And after analyzing this case and this whole subject, do you think EU law sets the right standard and is efficient enough to regulate the football economy and with the respective competition law?
I personally think the basis is there. Even though there's still a lot to do and there's still room for improvement, the sports industry is a very specific and complex ecosystem. So EU rules are sometimes too general and not quite adapted to it, which makes interpretation really difficult in court, for example, for the judges to decide on which matter is the best one and which rules should we apply to this case. But I really think we're on the right path, and EU institutions, like I said, remain very vigilant and try their best to supervise in the best way they can, even though it could be done in a better way sometimes. But yeah.
And how do you see this topic influencing the future of Europe?
I think in a world like the sports industry and, in the football world where money rules and player transfers can reach astronomical sums and amount of monies that are unbelievable, players themselves are not even sometimes benefiting from that, protection. So it's really important that there's a safe and ethical, transparent process that happens and that has to be reached while dealing with these proceedings. A lot of damage has already been done, and the football industry keeps on growing. So I think it's important to underline how much competition law and sports law go hand in hand. And also seeing that the influence of the European institutions already have very powerful influence on FIFA institutions, for example, but it's also very interesting to see that the Lisbon Treaty really set the foundations for that process. And even though a certain autonomy has to be reached, they still, push for something better, for something more transparent, and that's really important. And I think it's a very good thing that the sports industry now falls under the scope of the treaty. And, the EU does not hesitate to, raise their voice or intervene when they see that their interests are being threatened. To conclude, I would say that the EU will continue to grow and adapt itself to the sports industry for sure, even though the Treaty of Lisbon still has to be viewed in a critical way, like we all know. It sets some very good foundations, and the sports industry is a very complicated and fragile ecosystem, so it has to be handled in a very, helping way, if I can say it like that. especially knowing that the internal market is very important for the EU, and sports now holds a very important part in that internal market. The case we were talking about Valencia showed us that even though the Commission may act or take decisions, it does not always have the last word, and it does not always end up taking the right decisions. Sometimes in their attempt to regulate, the internal market and supervise everything, they also make mistakes. So there's still room for improvement, but it also shows how, the sports industry has to be regulated by an adaptive legal framework, because everything is always changing and everything has to be adapted to, particular circumstances. But it also makes it super challenging, and I'm sure that it will be a long-lasting, interesting domain, and it will continue to influence Europe in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Mariam, for this insight on the state aid granted in the football industry. It was very, very interesting to have this presentation, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you very much. Bye.